I've always loved the quiet of cul-de-sacs. There's something comforting about the closed circle, a small enclave cut off from the chaos of the world. At least, that's what I thought when I moved into Elmwood Court. 8 houses, a pristine street lamp in the middle, and a sense of community so strong it felt like I had stumbled into a postcard. But there was one house, always one, isn't there, that never quite fit the picture. The red house sat at the end of the court, tucked into the curve of the cul-de-sac. Its paint was cracked, the shutters crooked, and the front yard seemed to reject every season. No blossoms in spring, no golden leaves in fall, just a mess of weeds clinging to dry, lifeless soil. But what really made it stand out was the neighbor who lived there, Mr. Grayson. Tall, thin, with skin so pale it seemed to glow under the streetlights. He always wore the same thing, black slacks, a pressed white shirt, and a faded gray cardigan, even on the hottest days. And he always kept to himself. I'd never seen him smile, never heard him make small talk at the block parties or potlucks. He was an enigma, the kind of man you barely notice until you realize he's always there, watching. I didn't think much of him at first. You get used to quirks when you live in a small community. But then the noises started. It was late, maybe 2 in the morning, when I heard it for the first time. A faint scratching noise, like claws against wood. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or a raccoon. But when I peeked out the window, my eyes landed on the red house. A single light glowed in an upstairs window, and I swear I saw a shadow move behind the curtains. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined it, but as the days passed, the noises grew louder. Scratches, whispers, the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. Every night like clockwork. It wasn't just me either. I overheard the family next door talking about weird smells wafting from the red house. The kids on the block swore they saw Mr. Grayson digging in his backyard late at night, though their parents brushed it off as overactive imaginations. But the worst was the dog. Miss Hargrove's golden retriever, Max, was the friendliest dog in the world, until he wasn't. One evening, I was walking home from the corner store when I saw Max tugging at his leash, barking furiously at the red house. His fur bristled, and his usual playful demeanor was replaced by something feral, almost terrified. Miss Hargrove pulled him away, muttering about how he'd never acted like that before. That was when I started watching Mr. Grayson more closely. From my kitchen window, I had a clear view of the red house. Every morning I'd see Mr. Grayson step outside, carrying a metal bucket. He'd pour something, thick, dark, almost black, into the flower beds. The plants didn't grow, but they didn't die either. They just sat there, frozen in decay. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I waited until the street was quiet, then crept out into my backyard. From there, I had a direct line of sight to Mr. Grayson's basement window. It was small, grimy, but enough to see through if you crouched low. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single bulb, swaying slightly on a chain. At first, I didn't see much, just stacks of boxes, a workbench, and what looked like jars lined up on a shelf. But then I noticed the table. It was long and metal, like something you'd see in a morgue, and on it lay something, covered in a stained sheet, its outline grotesque and unnatural, as if whatever was underneath wasn't meant to exist. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, when suddenly Mr. Grayson appeared, his face inches from the glass. I stumbled backward, my heart nearly stopping as his expressionless eyes bore into mine. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. The next morning, I found a note on my doorstep. Stay out of my business. No name, no signature, but I knew exactly who had left it. For a while, I tried to convince myself to let it go. People have secrets. Who was I to pry? But then Mrs. Baker's cat went missing. The whole neighborhood searched for Whiskers. We checked under porches, in garages, even in the storm drains. Nothing. And yet that night, as I lay in bed, I swore I heard a faint meowing, coming from the direction of the red house. That was it. I had to know what was going on. I waited until midnight. Armed with a flashlight and every ounce of courage I could muster, I slipped out of my house and approached the red house. The front door was locked, but the side window slid open easily, as if it had been left that way on purpose. Inside, The air was thick and cloying, smelling of rot and chemicals. The walls were lined with shelves, each one crammed with jars. I shone my flashlight on one and nearly dropped it. Inside was a hand, small, shriveled, with too many joints. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream and pressed on, drawn by a low rhythmic sound, like chanting. It led me to the basement door, slightly ajar. I pushed it open and descended the stairs, each creak of the wood echoing like a gunshot. At the bottom, I found him. Mr. Grayson stood in the center of a crude circle drawn in what I hoped wasn't blood. Around him were things, creatures. They looked like they had once been animals, but were now twisted into something monstrous. Fur fused with scales, extra limbs sprouting where they shouldn't be. And in his hands, he held whiskers, whispering something I couldn't understand. The cat's body spasmed, its eyes glowing an unnatural green. "Stop!" I shouted before I could stop myself. Grayson turned, his pale face splitting into a grin for the first time. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and guttural. I don't remember much after that. I ran, tripped, got back up and ran some more. Behind me, I heard the screech of something that wasn't quite animal, wasn't quite human. When I burst out of the house and into the street, the sound stopped. The next day, the red house was empty. No sign of Grayson, no jars, no twisted creatures. Just an empty shell, as if no one had ever lived there. The neighborhood moved on. They always do. But I still hear those noises sometimes, late at night. And every now and then, I catch a whiff of that strange, rotten smell. I don't look out my window anymore. I never thought I'd leave the city for a quiet suburban street, but Sycamore Lane had this charm about it. Neatly trimmed hedges, kids riding bikes, the smell of fresh-cut grass. It was the kind of place that felt safe. That's what I told myself when I moved into the little blue house near the end of the street. I'd been there 2 weeks when I first met her. Mrs. Bell. She lived across the street in a gray house that seemed to absorb the light instead of reflecting it. The house was immaculate. A manicured lawn, sparkling windows, and a freshly painted porch swing. But the woman inside was the real picture of perfection. Mrs. Bell was in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, with hair as white as snow and skin smooth enough to make you wonder if she'd found some secret to aging. She always wore these floral dresses, carried a tray of cookies or muffins, and had a smile that stretched just a little too wide. She introduced herself the way neighbors do, friendly, polite, and overly interested in everything about my life. At first I thought she was just lonely. Maybe her husband had passed, or her kids had moved away. But the longer I lived there, the more I noticed things about her. Things that didn't sit right. It started with the lights. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and glance out the window to see Mrs. Bell's house glowing. Every single window had a light on, burning bright at 2, 3, even 4 in the morning. Sometimes I'd see her standing at the window perfectly still, staring out at the street. Once, I woke up around 3 a.m. to grab a glass of water. When I looked out my kitchen window, she was there, standing in her front yard facing my house. She wasn't doing anything, just standing. I ducked out of sight and didn't sleep much that night. Mrs. Bell started inviting me over a few days later. She'd come to my door with a plate of cookies and that wide smile. "You should come by for dinner," she'd say. "It's important to get to know your neighbors." I declined the first time, politely. I was tired from work, I said. But she was persistent. Every day for a week, she knocked on my door, each time with a new baked good and the same invitation. Finally, I gave in. Her house was spotless, as perfect inside as it was outside. Everything looked brand new. The furniture, the dishes, even the rug beneath the dining table. There was no dust, no clutter, nothing to suggest anyone really lived there. Dinner was awkward. She asked a lot of questions about my job, my family, my habits. She seemed especially interested in whether I lived alone. When I mentioned my sister sometimes came to visit, she frowned, just for a moment, before that too wide smile returned. "Such a shame you're all by yourself," she said. I left as soon as I could. That night, I had the first nightmare. I dreamed I was in my bed, unable to move. Something heavy pressed against my chest, and in the corner of my room, a figure stood in the shadows. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It just watched me. When I woke up, my heart racing, I noticed my bedroom window was open. I never opened that window. Over the next week, the dreams got worse. Sometimes I'd hear whispers, soft, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from inside my house. Other times, I'd wake up to find things in strange places. A chair pulled out from the table, my keys on the floor, the front door unlocked. And always, when I looked across the street, Mrs. Bell was at her window, watching. I decided to talk to someone about it. On a Saturday morning, I knocked on my neighbor Greg's door. He lived 2 houses down and had been friendly enough when I first moved in. When I mentioned Mrs. Bell, his face went pale. "You've been to her house?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah, for dinner. Why?" He shook his head. "Don't go back there. Just stay away from her." Before I could press him further, he closed the door. I started asking around. Most of the neighbors were polite but evasive when I brought her up. Finally, I found an older woman named Marjorie who lived at the end of the street. She invited me in and poured me a cup of tea. "You're new," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't know what she is yet." "What do you mean?" "She's not like us," Marjorie whispered. "She doesn't belong here." Marjorie wouldn't say more, but the fear in her eyes was enough to convince me something was wrong. That night, I barricaded my doors and windows. I was done playing games. But around midnight, the whispers started again. They weren't coming from outside this time. They were inside. I grabbed a flashlight and crept through the house, my heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, seeming to come from every direction. When I stepped into the living room, the lights went out. My flashlight flickered, casting long, warped shadows across the walls. In the corner, where the shadows were darkest, something moved. It was Mrs. Bell, or at least, it looked like her. Her smile was gone, replaced by a twisted grimace. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and her body seemed wrong. Her limbs too long, her movements jerky and unnatural. "You shouldn't have ignored me," she hissed, her voice layered with something deeper, something inhuman. I ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Behind me, she moved closer, her footsteps unnervingly soft. Desperate, I grabbed the lamp from the side table and swung it at her. She screamed, not in pain, but in rage, and her body crumpled into a pile of ash and shadows. The whispers stopped. The lights came back on, and when I looked across the street, the gray house was dark. The next morning, Mrs. Bell's house was empty. No sign of her, no furniture, no cookies. It was as if she'd never lived there at all. I thought I was free, but last night, as I lay in bed, I heard the whispers again, and when I looked out my window, there was a light in the gray house. Someone, or something, was home.